Hi, guys, and welcome to the fifth episode of Run the Gauntlet, which is a completely free program where every month you guys send me the opening scenes of your manuscripts, and I pick one lucky writer to receive a developmental edit of their opening scene. And the only catch is that it gets shared publicly with the writing community so that we can all share in the insights garnered, exchange ideas, and support one another to become better storytellers. This whole thing started because as a developmental editor, I can read or assess or develop literally hundreds of manuscripts in a year. And it's really interesting to me whether I'm working with really experienced best-selling clients or people who are right at the beginning of their writing journey. You see the same kinds of issues come up again and again in opening scenes. And these are definitely the red flags that agents and publishers kind of look out for when they're deciding whether or not they're interested in a project. And they're also the things that potentially distance you from your reader, whoever that reader might be. So the beauty of, writing being a craft is that this whole program isn't about me providing a personal opinion about the stories that I assess. It's not about trying to reinvent the wheel or find some magical X factor. We're just looking at techniques and devices that have been developed over thousands of years of storytelling that we can apply to these creative projects so that they really do hook a reader, be it an agent, publisher, or member of the general public, and grab their interest and refuse to let them go. So today we're going to jump straight into it. I'm really excited to share with you Hot Rocks by Ruth Morgan. Ruth is one of the loveliest writers I have encountered so far. She's a really sweet person. And she has written this crime story, and it has been several years in development. Like so many of us, it's one of those projects that you keep coming back to. It sits in the drawer and you develop it a little bit more, and then you move on to something else and circle back again. And I'm really excited for Ruth because I think that she has reached that point that many writers get to where it goes from being a hobby to something more. We kind of go, this is something I really care about. This is something that really gives me deep joy, and I'm going to take it really seriously. So Ruth's been incredible. She's been entering writing competitions and, doing the work, doing the editing, reading the books, and focusing more lately on her characterization. So as soon as I saw her project, I thought it was perfect for this program, and I'm really, really excited to help Ruth, and hopefully you guys will learn some cool stuff along the way as well. And I really, really also want to encourage you guys to take part in the conversation. So if I make a comment about the story that you agree with, fantastic. Tell me if you've had an experience in your own writing and you have something to contribute, please do. If I say something or suggest something that you actually feel misses the mark, include your thoughts below. I'm really, really interested in this idea of crowdsourcing feedback from people. And trust me, Ruth is such a lovely writer. This is exactly the kind of person you want to be supporting because she's really taking that next step into her writing. And the more feedback she can get from all of us, constructive feedback, the better. So please take part. And if you're interested in submitting your own story for Run the Gauntlet, please do so. There should be a link below. I won't go on about it, but the one thing I would say is life is short. Don't leave these stories in your drawer. Don't be afraid. You have nothing to lose. Getting feedback, working with editors, putting your story out into the world, it's something that you ultimately want to do, assuming that you want to, have readers interact with your work eventually. It's all about just ripping the Band-Aid off, getting it out there, not being too nervous or insecure about it, and sharing the stories that you have to share. If you push yourself to do that once or twice every week, do some action that pushes you out of your comfort zone. and gets you one step closer to sharing your stories with the world, getting the feedback that you need to make sure your story is as strong as possible, and that your craft as a writer is always being refined and developed, and you're becoming more masterful in the tools that you have. Go for it. You really have nothing to lose, and the more we can all share and support each other, the better for everyone, including your future readers. So without further ado, I'm just like breathless with excitement today. Let's jump straight into this manuscript. So to give you all an idea of how this works, we obviously have a manuscript here that Ruth has really kindly shared with us. Thank you so much, Ruth. And what I do is I read a short segment of the scene once through, and then you can see these mysterious comment boxes here. Once we've read this segment and you've got a feeling for the scene, I go back and I just deconstruct the scene with a few insights and a few recommendations. We can start to look at ways to really milk as much clarity, impact, character development, plot development, theme from the scene as possible. So without further ado, let's begin. Tuesday, 4th of July, 2017, 6:05 a.m. Lee Taylor pulled the car into the space at the curb, automatically switching off the headlights and engine. Superintendent Sean Sutton's orders ran through her head. Have nothing to do with Zach Burnett until after the inquiry. The formal question and answer session was scheduled for Wednesday morning. By Thursday, Zach may not have a career and the ban would be irrelevant. There was no reason Sutton needed to find out. She had to ask the man she loved one question. She had to know. It was as simple and as complicated as that. Lee Taylor pushed open the gate and walked along the side path, dodging the puddles. As was the tradition in her family, front door was for visitors, back door for family. Cold fingers of fear sent goosebumps over her skin. Nerves tingled in warning. The rear door was ajar. Danger. She reached under her jacket and withdrew her police-issued Glock 22. Okay, so right away we have a brief introduction to who our character is, and then we're jumping straight into this moment where she is walking into her the house of the man she loves, and obviously there is danger afoot. So let's bring up the comments and see where there is room to develop this further. Really minor comment that I have here at the start. It's really common actually to see these kinds of dates and times at the beginnings of manuscripts. One thing I would say is that the reader has such a limited attention span and also capacity for remembering detail, especially right at the start where they don't have any kind of existing story or context to anchor this information in their mind. So when we see, the name of the week, the name of the day, the day of the month, the year, the time of the day, realistically, most readers will glide straight past that without really noticing it. And if you ask them to restate what these details were by the end of the scene, almost all of them would have forgotten. So what I always say is only include details that are really, really, really important. And also look for ways to, if it's really important for us to know that it's early in the morning, like 6 a.m., look for a way to describe the way the light is falling, or how quiet the street is, or the chirping of, birds in the early morning, because a reader will remember those kinds of visual details as they set up the context and setting a lot more than they'll remember a string of numbers or dates for that matter. And obviously, if you have like a dual timeline story, well, then you might just have the year and the month and past or present, and then that's easy enough for readers to kind of keep track of. But if we go into too much kind of specific number and date detail, it's firstly, the reader won't remember it, but also their first introduction to the story is the first line that they're interacting with is something that they're not going to keep track of. So we really want that every interaction that the reader has, right down to every single line, to be as meaningful and memorable as possible. Now, the next point that I have is about this opening paragraph. So let's look at what we have here. Lee Taylor's pulling the car into the curb. She's switching off the headlights. Sean Sutton's orders are running through her head. There's an inquiry. There's a formal and question and answer session scheduled. We're thinking about Zach and a career and a ban. Now, that is a lot of very detailed and specific information, considering that your reader is coming right into this story with no idea of who these people are, what they do for a living, why there would need to be an inquiry, what the relationship is between Lee and, say, superintendent. Is he her boss, or is she a family member that's been dealing with him with an existing crime case? I mean, we just don't have much information. So what's happening here is that we're providing lots of details, but we're not providing lots of context. And there's a really important differentiation there. So when we provide details, it's a little bit like this first line, Tuesday, 4th of July, 2017, 6:05 a.m. They're fragments of information, but there's nowhere for us to really, we're entering this story for the first time, so there's nowhere to really plant that information so that it fits within a wider frame of context. Now, if we were to say that she's pulling up and the street is deserted and the early morning birds are singing and the sun is just peeking over the edge, suddenly we have context. Yes, we've got information, it's early morning, but we've told the reader something important. The street's empty. There aren't many people around to kind of witness what's about to happen. It's super early, so it's an unusual time to be coming to someone's house. Something is amiss. This isn't a normal behavior, like turning up at 11 a.m. for a cup of coffee. So this is the difference between context and information. Look to give your reader context, because context allows us to assess risk. It allows us to assess opportunities. It allows us to judge a character's actions and choices and why they're behaving a certain way. Whereas information is just more stuff that we have to file away in our heads. And some of that information will be really vital, but chances are we can actually introduce that information in a later scene, not right when we're first getting into the story and really trying to decide, is this a character that I find compelling? Is this someone, what does Lee Taylor care about? Who is she as a person? Is she pushy and bossy and impulsive? Is she, demure and kind of frightened and a bit of a victim character? These are the kinds of those emotional insights into a character. What makes them tick? What's important to them? Those are actually the things that we want to get a grasp of right at the beginning of the story when we're deciding whether we like them or not, whether we want to become emotionally invested in finding out what happens to them next. So context, not details and information. There's a fine line between the two. Now, as we progress further into the scene, Lee pushes open the gate. She walks inside. I have to say, I haven't included this in the comments, but this line, as was the tradition in her family, front door was for visitors, back door for family. When I first read that, it actually made me almost read it as if she was going to her own house and taking the back door for that reason, as opposed to this house following the same kind of rules of entry as her own house. So just potential little piece of confusion that you might want to avoid there. But mainly my main point here was that if you look at the way that this scene pulls out, we're really focused on the fact that the guy that she is going to go and visit is the person that she loves, and she has to ask him an important question. That's kind of the main detail that we've taken out of this. Now, we go from, as was the tradition in her family, front door was for visitors, back door for family. Cold fingers of fear sent goosebumps over her skin. The jump from, this is someone I have to talk to about something important, to, whoa, something's really wrong and I'm in danger, is so abrupt that it almost feels like it's kind of popped up out of nowhere. I see the opportunity here to add a little bit more of a sense of transition from that kind of romantic tension, they're going to have a confrontation, to she's in danger, either by adding more description, so that we, have just a couple of additional lines to kind of hint that something is not quite right, or to really build that tone that something is off right from the start of your scene, like describing things like the empty street, or describing little details that just kind of subtly hint to the reader in a very, very nuanced way, that this is not going to be a happy scene, and that this is a scene where there's going to be some level of risk, and the reader won't even necessarily be aware of the fact that that's what that tone was suggesting until they get to this point. But when that danger rears up, we want it to feel like a cohesive extension of the scene and the action that's unfolding, as opposed to like, oh, whoa, where did that come from? That's kind of like, giving us a bit of whiplash, because we're in one headspace one moment and then suddenly we're in another headspace a moment later. And I actually missed a little point here, which I'm going to go back to because it's important, just to go back to that idea of, context versus information and details. So if we're looking at this character and what's going on in this scene, she's just turned up to confront her lover. And obviously walking into the house, the door is ajar, so something is wrong. Now, if I'm going to be thinking from the perspective of who is my reader going to care about, how can I reveal to the reader who Lee is, what's important to her, and why I should become invested in finding out what happens to her next? I'm going to be coming at it from the perspective of showing that Lee is a cop, making that clear even through the kind of vehicle that she pulls up in, or her uniform, or whatever. And I would be showing that by pulling up at this house, she's actually risking her job. And we don't need to say why. We don't need to go into the details of there being an inquiry or a Q&A session or a superintendent that she's, fighting with, or anything like that. We just need to show that pulling up in front of this house and walking inside is putting everything that she's that she's worked for at risk. Because that context, that emotional tension is what is going to make your reader want to keep on reading, whereas all of the facts and details are kind of secondary to that. So let's move on to the next section. Okay, so moving right along. Leaning against the wall, she used her left heel to push open the door. Her left hand held the weapon. She waited. No response. No shots. Her leather boots were wet and would squeak on the wooden floors. Slipping them off, she walked cautiously into the kitchen. The early morning light was insufficient to see clearly. Her nose twitched as her nostrils filled with the acrid scent of blood. She removed a small flashlight from her pocket. Its narrow beam showed Zach Burnett lying on the lino. His face was turned away. The light-colored jacket soaked in blood, near his outstretched fingers a gun, a twin to the weapon in her hand. Dropping to her knees, she checked for a pulse. There was a faint, erratic beat beneath her finger. One brown eye gazed at her. Zach's eyelid closed and a slight shiver shook his body. She rang 000 on her mobile while she stripped a blanket from the bed, laying it over him. Police, code 1, officer down, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The operator was calm, her questions concise. Lee answered as clearly as possible. Response time, she asked. 10 minutes, said the operator, giving some brief instructions. And I'm just going to pause there again to come back and discuss some of the elements in this scene. So the earlier scene establishes that Lee is coming to the house of her lover to confront him or ask him a question about something. Now, in this line where we discover the body, she removed a small flashlight from her pocket. Its narrow beam showed Zach Burnett lying on the lino. His face was turned away. We are in Lee's point of view for this scene, and the way that we say its narrow beam showed Zach Burnett, it sounds like he's just a victim that she's found that she happens to know the name of. It doesn't read as if this is someone who she loves, by referring to him by his full name, So I think that there are different narrative styles, and sometimes you can use a more detached omniscient narrative style to convey your action. But in this instance, it seems to contradict with what we know about the character, which is that she's just found someone that she really loves and cares about, mortally injured. So I would rethink, even if it says that, its narrow beam showed, its narrow beam illuminated Zach lying on the lino. Just by referring to him by his first name rather than his full name instantly indicates an intimacy between them that feels more consistent with what we've been told so far. The next point I have is just in these kinds of crime or police procedural books. This is an example when she rings 000 on her mobile for our American viewers' cell phone, and while she stripped a blanket from the bed, laying it over him. I'm far from an expert on the matter, and this might be absolutely correct, but I would be speaking to someone in law enforcement about what the standard protocol is here, because I would imagine, to me, going and getting a blanket feels like something that someone who is not trained in first aid would go and do. You'll kind of be so flustered and so upset you wouldn't know what to do. I would think for a police officer, either you would be, stripping the shirt back to find where the injury is and potentially stop the flow of blood, or you would be securing the location in case the person who has done the attack has a weapon and is still in the vicinity and could potentially hurt you. So this is where you could talk to someone who does this for a living or has a background in the topic to make sure that the action that you're covering feels as authentic as possible. Now, you might also be making the point that this is the incorrect thing to do, but Lee is so flustered and so upset by what she's discovered that all of her training goes straight out the window, and instead she's kind of doing everything wrong because, the emotion has just taken over and clouded her judgment. But if that's the case, then we want to make sure that that's clear and that that's a deliberate kind of choice as opposed to an oversight in terms of authenticity. Moving on to the next section. Call complete, Lee put the phone in her pocket. Her gut tensed. Was that a rattling sound from the living room? A long corridor divided the house in two. With the Glock in her left hand and torch in her right, she moved quietly, listening intently for anything out of the ordinary. The bedrooms were to the left, the living spaces to the right. In every room she entered, there were signs of a search. Cupboards and drawers were all open, the contents scattered on the floor. The living room, with its stained glass French doors that opened out onto the small veranda, was the last room she entered. In the humid air, the stench of blood and excrement hung heavily. She gagged, putting her hand over her mouth until the urge to vomit retreated. A stranger lay on his back, facing away from the door. His right arm lay awkwardly beneath him, his left outstretched, fingers curled. Drying streaks of red marked the cream-painted walls. Blood had flowed over the floorboards, filling the spaces in between. He had short grey hair, well-muscled arms, and stocky build. His jacket lay open, cut like his neck from side to side. She squatted down and touched the man's hand, holding her breath. His skin was cold, the flesh beneath yielding. She took a quick photo of the room and the body with her phone before returning to the corridor and breathing deeply. Okay. So one thing I would say as well is that the general narrative and description, I think, has a really nice flow. I think that some of the imagery that Ruth has created here is really evocative and effective. I love that she's working with smell and sight and really bringing the horror of this scene to life. So, and the writing is easy to read. It's not trying too hard. It's not self-conscious. It's not overly flowery or florid. It feels tight, as if the different details that she's choosing to share with us all serve a purpose. So all of that is wonderful to see. Now, one thing I would say is, or the first comment that I have here, Now, if we read this as one section from the scene prior, Lee answered as clearly as possible. Response time, she asked. 10 minutes, said the operator, giving some brief instructions. Call complete. Lee put the phone in her pocket, her gun tensed. Was that a rattling sound from the living room? A long corridor divided the house in two. Now, keeping in mind, when I read this aloud, I'm obviously reading far more slowly than the average reader will read as they, take this in internally. And a detail like there being a rattling sound from the living room, or a sign that the killer is in fact still in the house, is a really important moment in the scene, and it's full of potential intrigue and tension. But if it's a detail that just kind of gets lost in the paragraph, then we're missing our opportunity to really have the reader on the edge of their seat as their skin crawls and they wait to find out who is there and what it means. So I definitely see room to, whenever you have these important moments of revelation in a scene, develop the description around them so that we're not like massively slowing the pace and making it drag, but we're building that sense of anticipation. So I've got a really rough example here, which I'll quickly share. Lee put the phone in her pocket. She was pressing her fingers to Zach's throat when she froze and awareness prickled through her body. A thud had come from the living room, or had she imagined it? She held her breath, caught between wanting to help Zach while fighting the trembling realization that they weren't alone. So you see how I've added that moment, the dread of that moment. I've gone a little bit deeper into it, as opposed to, having the sound here and then having, the action of pursuing that sound, Glock in her hand, and she's moving, happens so quickly that we haven't milked that moment of horror, of realization, for as much tension as possible. We've kind of swept it away in the action and kept the scene going. Moving on, just a really minor point here in terms of continuity, but we described a rattling scene, a rattling sound, which alerted Lee to the fact that there was the killer or another person still in the house. But when we come to this guy, he is cold and has clearly been dead for some time. So you still want to explain what that rattling noise was. Maybe there's a fan that's switched on that's kind of like rubbing against the curtain, or you might even have a pet, for example, and this is a bigger kind of story suggestion, but let's say that Zach had a dog that he loved, and maybe this dog becomes, if Zach passes away, this dog becomes a way to maintain his presence in the story, and explore the grief between them, and we find out that it's the dog that's made the noise in this scene. And moving on to the next section. She sat on the floor alongside Zach. There's an ambulance on the way. Can you tell me anything? Something? Did you see anything? Zach, please. She had to try. Did you see anything? I'm just going to pause for a moment there because I don't have a comment here. But obviously he saw something, because it's pretty clear that he's killed the other person in the room. So I would just try and make her language here, consistent with the action that we've just seen. Zach, please. She had to try. Silence. She asked again. Slowly, one eye opened. His mouth opened. He struggled to speak. She leant over to hear, the words indistinct, a light breath on her cheek. As she watched, his eyes closed. Tears ran in long lines down her cheek, falling from her chin as she stroked his damaged hand, her touch feather-light. Zach's ragged nails, the torn fingertips, the dried trail of blood on the floor were testament to his struggle for survival. Don't give up, she urged. Fight, please. She leant over and kissed him, a tear landing on his forehead. I love you, the sound a whisper. A thin film of sweat was cooling his skin, clammy beneath her fingertips. She leant against the wall, her hand resting on his and speaking to him softly. His eyes remained closed. The weapon lay on her leg, easily reached. Her nerves were on edge, instantly tuning into a sound from outside. Was it the killer? It wasn't the ambulance or the local cops. She hadn't heard sirens. Her hand gripped the pistol, finger on the trigger. Stealthy footsteps. The door opened. She raised the weapon. Okay, so I love this description of Zach's ragged nails, the torn fingertips, the dried trail of blood on the floor were testament to his struggle for survival. Really beautiful. You can definitely, these are the little human moments that take, crime and action and actually give it its weight and its sense of significance. Otherwise, it's just lots of bullets flying around and lots of blood. But it's these little details that really twist your heart and make you more invested in finding out what happens next. So as I've said in my comment here, really high emotion and some really beautiful description. We're really humanizing Zach in this moment. One thing I would say is that anytime we open a story with an opening scene that is highly emotional, like someone losing someone that is dying, it helps when we have a little bit more context. So in this example, we know that she loves Zach because she says as much. But it's not clear if they had been, lovers who had just started their relationship. Maybe he was the new cop that started a month earlier in her precinct and they instantly had a kind of affair. Maybe they've been working together for 15 years and they'd loved each other this whole time, but they kind of kept themselves from, pushing any kind of professional boundaries. And it was only really recently that they'd finally admitted their feelings for each other. Maybe Zach was a kind of casual fling. Maybe he was her whole hope and dream for the future and the person that she, thought she might marry one day and have children with. He might have been a kind of problematic boyfriend who she loved, but, was always going out and drinking with his friends or putting work first, or, there were some pretty serious issues with their relationship. Or maybe he was like the one, the perfect guy for her who really understood her and was like a best friend and a colleague and a comrade and a confidant and all of those things. It's hard to say. Those little pieces of context, it's not to say that we want to have a huge essay on their relationship to, really indicate exactly how long they've been together and all those details. But just inserting a few details here and there can help us understand the gravity and weight and impact of the loss that she has just suffered. So, even as the example I've got here, a bracelet on her wrist that he might have given her recently, a photo on the mantelpiece of a holiday that they took in Thailand a couple of years ago, or an engagement ring. But, these are we can just thread without being too obvious about it, because we don't want it to feel labored and manipulative. But, you can just thread a few little details here and there to give us a better idea of who this guy was to her. Obviously, they don't live together. Obviously, they're colleagues. So we sense a kind of, a little bit of separation there. But, I think that there's room to develop that picture somewhat and help us to understand her loss even more. And that is and I can't believe that we're already almost at 35 minutes. So I'm going to wrap things up there. The scene does continue and lots more action takes place, but I think that we covered some of the key ideas that I felt were most pertinent to, how engaging this scene is. Really, it always comes down to those two primary kind of factors that we're wanting to work with. Presenting the reader with a character who is compelling in some way, someone that we want to get to know, someone who we can immediately get a sense of their personality, whether they're a risk taker, whether they're a comedian, whether they're, they have anger problems, they push people away. Give us an idea of, in this case, Lee, obviously she's kind of consumed by the action that's taking place in this story. So she tends to take a bit of a step backwards while all of this other big stuff is happening. Look for ways to hint at who she is. What makes her unique as a person? Is she kind of person when as her lover is dying in her arms, she might crack an inappropriate joke to kind of make him laugh one last time, and it's kind of really tragic and bittersweet, but just says something about who they were as a couple. Maybe she suffered so much in her life and lost so much before this point that we see true kind of pain and fear here that suggests to us that this is a really traumatized person. But ultimately, the opening scenes aren't just about introducing your plot premise. They're about really making a statement about who the heroine is or who the hero is, and how this is someone that we can really understand on some level and relate to on some level. And the best way to do that is to give us an idea of their unique personality traits, their kind of strengths and weaknesses as a character, and their goals and motivations, what it is they want in life, what it is they're going for. And obviously you can't include all of that in an opening scene, or it would fall into kind of over explaining and being too obvious, but you can hint at these things. You can certainly hint at a character who is a bit acerbic and a bit rough around the edges, or tends to shoot first and ask later, or tends to be overly aggressive, more than say a character who is a total sweetheart and kind and excited about puppies and whatever. So these are the kinds of things that humanize someone. They make them more than just like a female cop doing her job. Why is Lee one particular type of person who happens to be a female cop as well? So this is where there's room to kind of develop those areas of character. But on the whole, I think that you'll agree that this is a really interesting scene. The second aspect of every opening hook is a plot premise that's full of intrigue, and we very much get the sense here that Lee's life is about to change drastically, that she is going to go on a journey that is going to test her in 101 ways. And there's tension and there's anticipation in that premise. So that's a great secondary aspect of that opening hook. If we can continue to refine who she is, who Zach was to her in their relationship, and really getting a feel for what she's lost, then wonderful. And sometimes it can be hard to find ways to really dig deep into your character, who your character is, when there is lots of crazy action taking place, because it's natural for that action to take center stage and kind of consume all of the focus of the scene. But if that's the case, then maybe we don't start this scene with Lee pulling up and walking straight inside and having a problem, discovering straight away that there's a murder that's taken place. Maybe instead we start this scene 3 minutes earlier, where she, almost hits a dog and then spends all this time helping the dog, and that gives us an idea of who she is. Obviously, that is a terrible example, but without knowing exactly who Lee is, we can craft a little interaction before the main action begins that gives us a vital insight into who this woman is and what she wants. So, for example, maybe she's had a crush on Zach for a long time and only recently, admitted her feelings for him. So in the car, she kind of puts on some lipstick, takes a look at herself, rubs that lipstick off, and goes, "What are you doing? You're in your police uniform. Stop trying to, overthink this. He's just a colleague. You're just going to go and talk to him." But just that tiny little bit of action is a relatable thing that kind of tells us who she is and allows us to, kind of get to know her and think, yeah, this is someone I want to keep following. This is someone kind of real and human to me. So even something small like that can anchor us in her humanity before we get swept away in all of the action that then unfolds. So that covers everything that I wanted to share with you guys today in this read. Applications for the next Run the Gauntlet are open. Please submit your work. Oh my God, and I totally forgot to share the code word, which today's code word is crime boss. in deference to Hot Rocks, the story. The code word is crime boss. Now, why do we have a code word? It's a little trick that I do to make sure that if you do put your manuscript in for the program and you mention the code word crime boss when you're submitting your application, see the link below. It tells me that you're actually an active participant in the community and you watch the programs and you enjoy the programs. And so it's not to say that your project will automatically be selected, or that if you don't put the code word in, you won't be selected, but it's just, it gives you a little edge, let's say. I've got a Run the Gauntlet editing offer at the moment. If you find the idea of sharing your work publicly to be completely horrifying, but you would still like to get professional feedback on your opening chapters, check out that edit offer below. Other than that, I just want to really thank Ruth so much for sharing your work with us today. I hope that you find some value in the insights that have been offered. I hope that you guys watching at home share your thoughts and ideas. We would love to hear them. That's what this is all about. And I will see you next month for the next project. So submit your manuscripts. I would love to see them. Your story was meant to be read, and there's a bigger chance it'll get read if you share your work, you put yourself out there, and we can all kind of take that journey together. There's nothing to be afraid of. You've got nothing to lose. So I look forward to reading your stories. And until then, run the gauntlet. All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.